What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. It's 6:31 p.m. where I'm at right now, starting this live stream on time. It's June 30th, 2024, and we are continuing our book react series for our second book here, Is the Turk a White Man?, written by Murat Ergin. I highly suggest everybody go pick up this book on Amazon for the humble price of only $30. This is not a paid sponsorship. Hell, Murat might see this video and get really mad at me and might try to copyright strike this. But this is all used under fair use. I'm giving commentary on the book. This is no different than somebody reacting to, a video on YouTube or some TV show or something like that. So yeah, that's the point of this series, where I read a text, interact with the text, and give my automatic reaction about it. I got a bunch of other books that I really want to read, and I think it's important for all of us to read. Whether you like the books on this channel that I will be reacting to or not, I encourage you to pick up a book, read for yourself, find what you're interested in, because the mind is universal. We should always be trying to gain new knowledge, and the purpose of reading, especially for us as Black men, is to honor our ancestors and to continue on in the growth of our intelligence. Because what was the number one thing the white supremacists did not want us to do? They did not want us to read. They did not want us to be educated. They tried their hardest to try to make sure Black men, Black people were not educated. And we should continue to try to expand our minds no matter what, right? So, in the first part of this video series for book react for Is the Turk a White Man? In part one, we read the introduction and chapter one, where he went over why he decided to write this book, and then and in chapter one, he talked about all of the reasons people gave him not to write this book. In chapter two that we were reading yesterday, he was really going off in a long-winded way to make the argument that the past does matter and that the past does influence today, and the narratives that we tell about our past influence how we look at our present and how we look at our future, and how the past can be altered just by using words, right? He gave the example that, in the 1980s in Turkey, they had a revolution, like a coup, like the military tried to overthrow the government. So the government, when they quashed the coup, they started calling the revolution that happened at the end of the Ottoman period, they started calling that the Republican Reform rather than the Republican Revolution, as to not to try to motivate the people to actually try to fight against the system and fight against the government. So the uses of words and language when telling the story of the past can influence how we look at it. And he was really, going off in chapter two in long-winded philosophical ways to make the argument that the past is important. From my impression, I feel like this book is written for an audience of people who are hesitant to even talk about race, racism, whiteness, white supremacy in the Turkish context, right? That was my understanding. And then we ended chapter two, in the parts where he was talking about the narrative of how Turkey, modern Turkey, came to be, right? And that's where we ended off because I had to go to work. So we're gonna pick up from this point right here. This is page 44 in the book for anybody who has it. And what was I going to say? One last thing. So basically, he's going through the story of how modern Turkey was created, at least to how it's taught to high school kids who are in their history class. Basically, the history book says the Turks are an exceptional people who created civilizations multiple times throughout history. They conquered Anatolia and sort of freed the people and brought justice against the cruel Byzantine Christian rulers there. And then their empire expanded into Europe. And the reason why the Ottoman Empire was so great and so successful was because the rulers were just, they were wise, they were educated, and they were fair to the people. But over time, the rulers, as they continued to get richer, became, fat, corrupt, easily persuadable, and not focused on the mission of maintaining a pious empire. And also the second thing that they are teaching the kids in Turkey, from my understanding of this book, is that because the Ottoman Empire was so big and it had Armenians, Arabs, Greeks, all these different minority groups sort of tore apart at the fabric of the nation because they were only focused on their ethnicity, their race, or their culture, rather than the unified Ottoman Empire, which is which is perverse in a certain type of way, because the Ottomans forced themselves upon the Arabs. They forced themselves upon the Armenians. They forced themselves upon the Greeks. And then you're wondering why the Arabs and the Greeks would want their own independence, why they are focused only on their people. And so he was going through he was going through each point of the history that they tell the kids in Turkey, and pointing out the hypocrisy in it, the paradoxes within it, the fallacies that are within the narrative that is taught to the kids, right? So continuing here, I'm continuing with the story that he is reading here about how Turks tell history to the kids and the parts that are false within it. And that will be the end of chapter 2. And we're going to try to read all of chapter 3 today. And I think chapter 3 is the longest in this book. So y'all bear with me. I might be on here for like 3 or 4 hours, maybe, chopping it up, reading every single comment that comes in here. But I really want to get through chapter 3. And I kind of want to finish this book by the end of this week. So let's get to it. Let's get to it. So, the European powers were planning to partition the Ottoman Empire according for their own benefit, starting in the 17th and the 18th centuries. Russia's unchanging goal was to occupy the Turkish Straits and thus gain access to the Mediterranean. The Ottoman sultans were not able to implement the necessary reforms to save the Ottoman state. In fact, although outside enemies always wanted to destroy the Turkish state, no Turkish state in history collapsed only because of the activities of external enemies. Internal sectarianisms leading to loss of internal cohesion were the main factor in the demise of Turkish empires throughout history. The so-called tulip period in the early 18th century, named for a contemporary tulip craze among the elite, constitutes one of the first examples of reform in the Ottoman Empire. Although useful inventions such as the printing press were introduced into Ottoman society in this period, the reforms generally involved imitating the extravagant lifestyles of the French court. The Ottoman rulers wasted people's money on unnecessary palace festivities. Ottoman military technology was so backward that the army and the navy were dependent on European technology. In the 18th century, the Western powers attempted to take advantage of the multi-ethnic structure of the empire by instigating unrest among the Ottoman minorities. The French Revolution had no influence on the Turkish core of the empire. However, ideas of nationalism, freedom, and independence spread quickly among the Christian minorities. With the interference and assistance of the Western powers, ethnic uprisings flourished across the empire throughout the 19th century. Serbs, Greeks, and Bulgarians, among others, betrayed the state, despite the freedom and prosperity they were given in the empire. Armenians were pampered by the pronouncements of Ottoman Empire officials to the effect that Armenians were innocent and loyal subjects of the state. Actually, Armenians were neither innocent nor loyal to the state. Their activities concerning the state in which they lived after the end of the 19th century was beyond all tolerance, fully treacherous and hostile. Jesus Christ. Now, I know in American history books, at least for me, like, I remember I told this story in my previous live stream. Like, I remember arguing with my teachers about, our nation's founding, how we say we were a nation founded on ideals of freedom for everybody and all men are created equal and everything like that. And at the same time, they own slaves, right? I remember arguing with my teachers about that, but they never wrote about the black Africans in my history books, saying that they were treacherous and that they were barbarians and that they were savages and stuff like that. Maybe some subtext is there, but this is crazy that they would like write this in a history book for Turkish kids to read. And this is a high school textbook cited in Germalas in 2004. So 2004, like in 2004, like 14-year-old kids were in high school reading this, that the Armenians were treacherous and they betrayed the state and all that sort of stuff. That's crazy. All right. Besides, the Ottomans had to give special economic privileges called capitulations to European merchants operating within the borders of the empire. Starting in the 18th century, capitulations could be lifted only by Ataturk's efforts after the War of Independence. For anybody who's listening to this for the first time and you don't know Turkish history, basically Ataturk is like the George Washington of modern Turkey. He was a guy who lived at the early 20th century, liberated the Turks from the backwards Ottoman Empire rulers, whatever, and basically ushered in democracy and modernization. Okay, brief, very brief overview. Continuing here, European interference in political and economic affairs of the Ottoman Empire weakened Ottoman independence to such an extent that the survival of the empire became entirely dependent on a skillful manipulation of the European balance of power. So, this is what Murat, the writer of the text, has to say in response to the history that the kids are getting from their textbooks in school. The rhetoric of internal and external enemies and the need to maintain unity are the bread and butter of nationalist historiography. The narrative emanates a sense of constant threat from internal and external enemies, usually left vague, but the target is easily sensed by students. The message of the necessity of internal unity to thwart off the sinister plans of enemies successfully functions well in the context of the Republican regime's aversion to heterogeneity. Others' nationalisms tend to be seen as treachery, whereas Turkish nationalism appears to be a benign response. The recurrent themes of external enemies and backstabbing minorities continues to invent an anachronistic sense of Turkishness. The love-hate relationship toward Western technology is introduced with the advent of modernity. It is important to note that certain canned phrases such as heroism, sacrifice, the indivisibility of the nation, and enemies frequently appear and are used under diverse situations and historical periods. Thus, historical time is virtually entirely abstract, efficiently removing the past of its contingent and context-dependent nature and presenting didactic historical accounts for contemporary purposes. So just to summarize that, to make this more clear or plain, my reaction to that text, he's basically saying, like, when the Turks write about history and the nation and the pre-modern Turkey to the Ottomans, they say that the nations that the Turks were building was a good thing, and that the nationalism that existed amongst the Greeks and the Armenians when they were looking out for their people, that's a bad thing. Right? It can never be considered in nationalist history when you tell the story that, hey, maybe your nation did the bad thing. Maybe your nation invaded that group of people. Maybe your nation brutalized that civilization or something like that. That cannot be told. It has to always seem like the Turks were in the right when with everything they did in their history, right? Continuing here. Because of territorial losses, the Ottomans introduced reforms to catch up with Europe, but religious fanaticism did not allow the reforms to take root. Although reforms did not spread to large segments of society, a small minority enjoyed a superficial and extreme modernization by imitating Western lifestyles, especially in clothing, education, cuisine, and language. This group's habits and worldview were so different from those of the ordinary people that they could in no way understand and solve ordinary people's problems. Although reforms introduced Western science and technology to the Ottoman Empire in a limited way, they also resulted in wasteful consumption among the ruling elite. Ottoman culture lost its earlier essential characteristics. Ottoman architecture and literature began to imitate Europe in a superficial way and produced only inferior examples of European art. Modernization of the army and navy produced useful results, but the effects were not long lasting because military reforms too were dependent on European money, technology, and expertise. The Tanzimat reforms started in 1839 and promised many things: equality among all Ottoman subjects, limitation of the Sultan's power, and instituting the rule of law. However, none of these promises were kept. In reality, the Ottoman government adopted these measures only in order to appease Western powers. Although unsuccessful and superficial, these reform attempts paved the way for the first constitution of 1876. However, the Sultan used the power granted to him by the constitution and dissolved the parliament, issuing a decree to suspend it indefinitely. The fact that the ethnic structure of the parliament disrupted its work played a role in this decision. Against the oppressive regime of the Sultan, intellectual organizations loosely called the Young Ottomans and later the Young Turks were formed. The Young Turks established a secret society, the Committee of Union and Progress, and continued their activities in Europe. The second constitutional period started in 1908 as a result of their efforts. So that is the history that the young kids in Turkey are taught. Here is how Murat, the writer of this book, would reply. The narrative walks on a fine line here. On one hand, Ottoman modernity is regarded as both too superficial, only the elites benefited from it, and too deep, reforms simply imitated the West, resulting in a loss of Turkish identity, lest the Ottoman modernization rival Republican modernization. On the other hand, reforms are presented as enlightened efforts countered by backward forces in the society. This rhetorical device helps legitimize the way the new regime dealt harshly with alternative discourses. Portraying the Ottoman elites as insincere modernizers helps contrast the comprehensiveness of Republican reforms. The narrative follows a cautious strategy with the precursors of the Kemalist regime, the Committee of Union and Progress. While their fight against the Ottoman regime seems praiseworthy, the narrative vehemently denies any direct historical and ideological links between Republican and Unionist rule in order to confer a sense of genuineness on the Republican regime. Basically, what they're trying to say here is that, when the Turkish kids are told the story of how Turkey became a democracy, the Turkish history books try to stick close to the facts, but twist them in a certain way. So there was the Tanzimat when the Sultan said, you know what, we're going to try to have freedom for everybody, equality for all, introducing like the rights of man basically in Turkey, right? And then later on, he sort of reneged on those promises. Later on, after that, young reformers, people who wanted to try to change the Ottoman system from within, they formed this secret underground democratic freedom fighter group called the Young Turks, right? And it sort of builds on this history that, the democracy of Turkey was nascent in nascent stages, and it reached its full pinnacle when Kemal or Ataturk came, if that makes sense. Continuing here. After the defeat of the Ottomans in the Balkan Wars, the Union and Progress government realized that the idea of Ottoman citizenship would not keep the empire together. Even Muslim peoples, such as the Kurds and Arabs, were seeking independence from the empire. As a result, an interest in Turkism and Turkish nationalism grew among the Ottomans. External threats to the empire increased substantially in this period, but the Committee of Union and Progress were not able to inaugurate long-lasting reforms. The Ottoman Empire sided with Germany in World War I. Although the Ottoman forces fought heroically in the war, they were declared defeated upon Germany's surrender in 1918. The Treaty of Sevres stipulated a partition plan. According to the treaty, British, Italian, French, and Greek forces occupied Anatolia. Only a small territory in the Anatolian heartland would remain for the Turkish people. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Sultan was doing nothing but pursuing his own self-interest. For this reason, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk resigned from his post in the Ottoman army and started a national resistance movement in Ankara. A national parliament representing the will of the Turkish people opened in 1920. The following 3 years witnessed the unfolding of the War of Independence. The Turkish people mobilized around Ataturk to save their nation and homeland and won a number of victories against invading European powers. Eventually, understanding that they could not subject Turkish people to their rule, the European armies could do nothing but leave. Ataturk declared the Turkish Republic in 1923. So, here is what the writer of this book, Murat Ergin, has to say in response to that narrative that's taught to the kids. The final message of decline, fragmentation, and the necessity of a national state are given before narrating a turning point in which an almost miraculous transformation delivers a Republican regime to the country with the help of the modernizing elite. The elite is consistently presented as the true representatives of Turkish people, despite the lack of any institutionalized system to measure the existence of popular support. All historical connections with the past appear lost in the narrative, thus contributing to the sense of an authentic beginning out of nothing. All right. This reminds me of what we spoke about in our last live stream where we read this book. Basically, conversion theory, right? The Republican conversion narrative. What does it mean to convert to a religion? Usually, when you convert to a religion, your life is in shambles, your mind is in shambles. You don't know exactly what to believe, whether God is real or not, whether God is there for you or not. So then all of that then crystallizes when you decide to make that leap of faith to join a new religion, right? And so that's sort of very similar to the narrative that they tell about Turkishness and the creation of their nationality or their nation state, the modern nation state, right? They had a solid core with the Ottomans, but then it fell into decay. Then it became fragmented, and then one figure, almost a prophet-like figure in Ataturk appears to create the new nation, and the state is reborn, and Turkishness is reborn. And for anybody who doesn't know, Ataturk means in Turkish the father of the Turks, making him almost like a messiah type figure for Turkish people. Continuing here. Such is the narrative that has shaped the worldview of generations of students educated according to its principles, a progression from a torn and fragmented empire to a coherent modern nation state, following a linear path from multiplicity to unity with a dramatic reversal of fortunes or conversion from chaos to stability. As we now will see in greater depth, the discourse of race figured centrally in the assertion of that putatively stable unity. Okay, so from the introduction to chapter 2, Jesus Christ, he hasn't even really touched on the creation of whiteness or how the Turks perceive themselves as white yet. I know this might be a long-winded book for a lot of people. This book is probably the most complex book that we've read so far. We've only read 2. Like, this is the second one, right? This one is very hard, but we're grasping it together. He is building up to the argument about becoming white, right? And that's the beginning of chapter 3. How did the Turks become white, or why did they want to identify as white, and so on and so on. So took us a while to get there, but that's because, once again, this book is not meant for people who already understand white supremacy, whiteness, the creation of whiteness, and the after effects of colonialism. This book is written for people who are academics who automatically think that there is no racism in Turkey, that there is no anti-blackness in Turkey, that the Turks don't think about race only except when they're talking about Kurds and Arabs. You get what I'm saying? So, continuing here, chapter 3, encounters with the quote-unquote West, becoming white. How far back in time do we need to travel in order to place Republican racial discourses in historical context? Any attempt to examine the racial formation of Turkishness in Republican scientific discourses would be incomplete if the narrative starts in 1923, when the new republic was proclaimed, because even the most radical revolutions build upon names, battle cries, and costumes borrowed from the past, as Marx said, looking back at the piecemeal evolution of discourses and the material world. It appears that Ottoman efforts to establish a meaningful presence within the new cosmology of Western modernity show continuities with Republican modernization, in that both employed the discourses of race to achieve their ends. Basically, what he's trying to say here is that, you know, the Turks didn't just decide, hey, we're going to become white in 1923 when they started their new country, the modern democratic country of Turkey, right? They were using the language of whiteness and incorporating that aspect of modernity, the creation of race, well into the Ottoman era, right? Because think about this. The Ottomans were around at the beginning of America, which is crazy to think about, right? In 1776, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were standing around in pantyhose, writing their, Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And at the same time, halfway across the world, there was a guy with a funny hat who was considered the Sultan, the leader of the Muslims, and he had a harem full of like blonde, blue-eyed Russian broads that were ready to suck and duck anything that he said. You get what I'm saying? That's crazy to think about, that those two things existed in history at the same time. So we know in America that was like, race was already created well before the creation of America. So before the creation of Turkey, there was already the conception of race, whiteness, anti-blackness, of course. Yeah, continuing here. All right. Race and modernity operate in close affinity. The emergence of Turkishness as a chromatic category was tied more closely to the rise of Western modernity and its reception in Turkish society than to the transition from imperial to republican form of governing. For this reason, a historical background that aims to recreate the conditions that led to the formation of chromatic Turkishness should take us back to the beginnings of Ottoman modernity in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the imperial order made its acquaintance with nationalism and racial theories and invited the ghosts that haunted Republican modernizers. However, such continuities will take us only as far as a significant event that stands in their way, the creation of the Republic itself. While modernity and the engagement with race and nationalism constitutes a more than 200-year-long historical development in Turkey, it is important to distinguish the imperial and republican regimes not only quantitatively, but also qualitatively. While there are continuities, the strength and appeal of racial and nationalistic discourses, as well as their legitimacy and discursive dominance, show differences in different periods. This chapter will do two things first. First, it will trace perceptions of the West and Western modernity in late Ottoman period. This will lay the groundwork to examine how race and modernity were complementary rather than competitive in Ottoman thinking, and how this thinking seeped into the Republican era. Second, it will analyze Western perceptions of Turks, which were often racially formulated, right? This is important because Western perceptions of Turks shaped Turkish perceptions of Western modernity. Republican reformers were particularly receptive to racialized views of Turks in the West, and they were intent on correcting these views by concocting racial the theories of their own. By concocting racial theories of their own. There are some typos in this book. The looking glass exchanges between Turkish perceptions of the West, Western perceptions of Turks, and the Turkish perceptions of Western perceptions supplied the groundwork for the racial origins of Turkish identity. All right, jumping into the comments here. Andre Beha says, "Hi, Simon, I've missed you. I'm sorry that I haven't joined your lives." It's okay, Andre Beha. I miss you too. Thank you for joining. I appreciate you for joining in. Come join in any of our lives, any of our videos. Leave comments. I will read every comment. I do not text for every comment, but I will try to reply to everything that's in the live chat. Anyway, continuing here. Yeah, basically, once again, he's saying like the Ottomans definitely thought about race and whiteness once race was created as a global phenomenon that everybody was aware of. And yeah, it was not, conflicting with the ideas of the Ottomans as well as with the Republic as well. In fact, they were complementary things. What he is implying there, what he is implying is that the Ottoman Empire probably saw their right to rule as being another part of the white race, right? Like, think about this. Like, when World War II happened, everybody got on Japan's ass for like colonizing Korea and colonizing China and stuff like that. But when the Russians were colonizing all of Central Asia, nobody batted an eye, at least in Europe, right? Um, when you're a part of the in group, you're sort of allowed to act as bad as that in group is, right? And that's what the Turks probably used for their justification for their empire over the Balkans, right? Yes, we are conquering other white people, but we're white ourselves, so we're going to act upon empire because that's what white people do, right? At least according to the time. Continuing here, race and modernity are intertwined at their points of origin. Racial definition and its attendant forms of racist articulation emerge only with the institution of modernity, and they transform in relation to the principal formative development in modernity's self-understanding and expression. A racialized discourse of identity emerged and flourished as a response to modernity in the Turkish context, where the gradual rise of Western modernity endangered older forms of identification in the Ottoman Empire, as it did across the globe. Religious, communitarian, and dynastic affiliations slowly came under attack, while the values of liberal individualism and nationalist and racial modes of thinking made their entry into a society previously characterized by many kinds of diversity, including ethnic, religious, and cultural differences. Individual liberty and equality have been important components of Western modernity, but intellectuals in the West were also engaged in the momentous pseudoscientific task of classifying groups of people according to their racial and ethnic worth. That is like a funny paradox, right? Like at the same time that they were saying all men are created equal, they were also doing like, race science where they were like measuring the people's jaw lines and skulls and the bridges of their nose and stuff like that to classify different groups of people. Like if all men are created equal, why would you continue to try to classify different races of people? It shouldn't even matter, right? Continuing here. It was in this context that the Ottoman elite realized that claiming selfhood in the modern world would not be possible without establishing a racial affiliation. Race thus became one of the ways to identify with the West in both the Ottoman and later Republican pursuits of modernity. For the Ottomans and Republicans, incorporating and reinterpreting racial vocabularies offered opportunities to affiliate with the project of modernity on the side of the classifiers. Racial taxonomies emphasized the linkage between white and modern so successfully that the direction of causality was eventually lost in the process. If modern was exclusively white, then only whites could be modern. Let's think about this. Let's take a step back. I know we're reading this book and we're thinking, oh, that was the ancient past. How can people think like that? Or that was 100 years ago. People's minds have changed. You will still find people now. And I've read these in the comments, mostly from Albanians, but you will not be surprised how many well meaning, educated people still say stupid stuff like, white people have to be smarter than black people because all the rich nations in the world are white European. Like, this is something that still deep down inside, if you break down the layers of what the white supremacists say, what race realists say, what basically even good meaning white folks who don't have any sort of understanding, and some black folks too as well, and non-white folks of any stripe or color, they'll still say stuff like, the white people have to be better because look at Africa. Africa's full of black people and it's the most dangerous, poorest place on the earth. And then look at Europe. It's full of white people and it has all the things that the world ever wants or needs at one place, right? There are still people that think like this. So yes, whiteness and modernity are still tied together. You get what I'm saying? I know I don't want anybody reading this or listening to this thinking that this is just, old ways of thinking, like cobweb thinking. This is still alive today. But I'll continue here. So, if modernity was exclusively white, then only whites could be modern. When the elites in non Western countries realized that the rational individuals of modernity turned out to be exclusively white, male, European, and bourgeoisie, they scurried to establish their own racial purity and whiteness. Race had become a criterion for weeding out those who would eternally be excluded from the Enlightenment project of establishing the universal rights of man. So basically, what he's saying here is like when the Ottomans found out that the Europeans, the French, and the British were saying that, the highest level of man is the white European Anglo-Saxon, the Turk said, well, the highest level of man is the European Turkish man in Istanbul. Like, that's what they were trying to do. Like, because basically they were trying to copy. They were trying to copy everything that the Europeans do. So, of course, they were going to copy the race science as well. So, this is for anybody out there who's listening to this. And we're not even halfway done with this book. But keep in mind, if the Ottomans were copying how the Europeans were playing bocce ball or polo on horseback, of course they're going to copy the race science as well. Continuing here. Although the Ottomans made their acquaintance with racial ideas in the 19th century, the Republican elite took this acquaintance further after they realized that an effective way to acquire the abstract and universal identity of modernity was to cling to the concrete and particular identities of white and European. The act of scientific classification itself implied that the categories thus fabricated were natural, unchanging, and irreversible. For that reason, it was important to make all possible claims to whiteness and Europeanness, even outlandish ones, in a language that stressed the antiquity and natural purity of such a racialized identity. Nationalisms in the emerging post-colonial era have faced a difficult paradox. Encounters with colonialism and all of its associated form of subordination and exploitation yielded to quests to build an anti-colonial identity. The cultural autonomy, and particularly that are so central for late emerging nationalisms, coexist with a related desire to compete with the West using a strategy of modernization usually conceived of as fighting the West with its own weapons. The paradox involves inventing a putatively unique folk culture while adopting a universal scheme of modernization, and doing this in a world dominated by the West. Moreover, one of the fundamental tenets of Western modernity for which post-colonial nationalisms have yearned is that the very subjects of late adoption, the colonial, Eastern, backward subject, are constructed as objects that are the negation of modernity. The definition of modernity presupposes the existence of others whose essential qualities make them unfit for modernity. A major problem emerges at this point. Why is it that non-European colonial countries have no historical alternative but to try to approximate the given attributes of modernity when that very process of approximation means their continued subjugation under a world under which only sets their task for them and over which they have no control? That's a complex way of saying, why are you accepting modernity? Why are you accepting the West's values when the West values tell you that your natural being or your culture is the opposite of it? It's backwards, it's barbaric, it's savage, right? And those things, even if you adopt them fully, they still negate who you are, right? This is something that should be basic, like 101 for anybody who's thought deeply about blackness, right? In a white supremacist world, what does it mean to be black in a world where we adopt so many things of our oppressors, like their language, like their religion, like their clothing, like their speaking patterns, like their way of living, when so much of it negates us, right? You get what I'm saying? I was just thinking about this phrase. He got so scared he turned white, right? We use that phrase so commonly in English, right? Imagine a black person says, "I was so scared, oh my Lord, I almost turned white," right? White and pale in the face. You get what I'm saying? Like, we use language like that. And even in other language, like if you remember in the film Malcolm X, right? They Malcolm was looking through the dictionary, black male, black jack, black hacker, whatever, right? Like, everything we connote with negativeness in English is associated with blackness, and then we are black people, right? So it's sort of very basic stuff right here, but still a good question to ask, just in a very long-winded way. So while denying this supposed inferiority of colonized people and stressing the possibility of successful post-colonial modernization, nationalism has produced a discourse in which, even as it challenged the colonial claim to political domination, it also accepted the very intellectual premise of modernity on which colonial domination was based. Post-colonial nationalisms all too frequently face the option of essentialist identities of race and ethnicity to deal with these tensions. It is, of course, possible to maintain that Turkey's case is not generalizable to post-colonial cases because the country has not been colonized, unlike other places where late nationalisms took root. Can we then say that Turkey's modernization was endogenous, and did not face the paradox of authenticity versus adoption? As we will see in more detail in Chapter 4, mutual feelings of resentment between Turkey and Europe resulted in a modernity that was both for and against the West. Although colonialism per se was absent, an acute perception of injustice and a sense of resentment toward the West were rampant throughout Turkey's era of modernization. In addition, modernity and racial vocabularies in the Turkish case were cooperative, not competitive. Chromatism linked modernity and racial classification in unwavering ways and gave the Republican modernizers a way to claim modernity while maintaining a semblance of unique identity. After all, if Turks were one of the inventors of modernity and original members of the white race, no one could call them imitators. Rather than being an aberration in the otherwise merely civic framework of Turkish nationalism, racial discourses of the Europeanness and whiteness of Turks operated as systemic components of modernization. Basically, what he's trying to say here is that a lot of the times in these post-colonial nations, right, they adopt some unifying culture that brings their nation together after so many years of being dominated by a foreign culture, right? And then also try at the same time to adopt Western ways or modernized ways that come from the West to try to advance their nation state, to catch up to the West from all the resources that were extracted from them. Turkey was never colonized fully, right? Like, the British didn't have control over the country for like 10 or 20 years, like Palestine or something like that, right? But in this case, it was still pre- important for the shapers and makers of modern Turkey to tie themselves to modernity in some way, to not be left behind. And modernity was still tied to whiteness, right? And so even though they didn't have that cultural revolution, they still needed that sticking glue to bind together the nation, and also at the same time try to modernize the nation by clinging to whiteness or attaching the identity of their people to whiteness. Continuing here, at the basis of the Republican elite's modern self-image was their rejection of the Ottoman past. On the one hand, the Republican modernizers deemed modernization to be a necessary and desirable end, and they were ready to crush anything, including their own past, they thought would be an obstacle on the road to modernization. The late Ottoman modernization, on the other hand, complicated this project of forgetfulness. Rejecting the Ottoman past simultaneously implied rejecting the late Ottoman modernization, which in turn required constructing a non-Ottoman nationalist modernity. Characterizing the late Ottoman westernization as both too superficial and too alien was the most obvious way to do this. It was said to be superficial because it involved only the elites and did not successfully penetrate penetrate into the larger segments of Ottoman society. Westernization in the Ottoman past was also said to be too alien to most Turks, according to the Republican conversion narrative, because it was too cosmopolitan and imitative. Simply put, the Ottomans disregarded Turkishness when they adopted modernity. Despite the content despite the continuities between them, Republican modernization claimed to involve a much more comprehensive project for the purpose of going beyond both the superficiality and the imitative cosmopolitanism of Ottoman modernization. What was important in this double critique is that modernization in the Republican period was presented as a project surpassing all the complications of the Ottoman period and manufacturing a coherent identity. The entire project of deciding once and for all what Western, Eastern, Ottoman, and Turkish are dependent on an ideology of classification. That is how the Republican modernization emerged as a response to the Ottoman modernization. It was a continuation of Ottoman modernization, but claimed to be a radical critique of it at the same time. Once the Ottoman past was out of contention in the efforts to build the image of the new Turk, a hodgepodge collection of scientific and pseudoscientific evidence was concocted with the intention of creating a Turkish past out of pre-Ottoman, pre-Islamic, and even prehistoric periods. This new invention was preferable to the Ottoman past because it did not carry the heavily charged historical baggage of Ottoman society, and hence the past would not offer any viable alternative to the newly created Republican order and its attendant modernity. Movements claiming to instigate revolutionary change can rarely resist the lure of rewriting the past. Inventing a new past was nothing uniquely Republican in this sense. The Ottoman elite, too, had encountered similar challenges, and they, too, had invented a tradition with which to contrast their modernity. For example, the 19th century Ottoman male feminists were ardent critics of polygyny, early marriages, and large extended families in Istanbul, as we will see in chapter 4. Since the invention of others is an important aspect of modernity, however, it is not surprising to see the Ottomans themselves ending up being designated as the other of modernity in the Republican era. Even in contemporary Turkey, the boundaries between imperial and republican regimes are imagined so rigidly that the idea of any continuity appears taboo. What made the Republican Identity Project problematic was the fact that rejection of the Ottoman past entailed refusing the basic tenets of Ottoman modernity, tenets that, in fact, paved the way for the Republican regime. Turkish modernity could neither be too Ottoman nor too Western. Racial vocabularies came to the rescue when it was time to fill in the content of this peculiar modernity, a modernity that was, at least initially, a product of this neither nor negation. The Republican tendency to link modernity and whiteness was possible as a result of such a contradictory project, marking Ottoman modernity as both too superficial, i.e., too elite, and too foreign, i.e., too Western, to the extent of losing touch with Turkishness, led to a search for authenticity in the essentialism and assurance of race. Against the rootless and imitative modernization, the Republican way was constantly presented as something more than a simple derivative discourse. Modernity, it was claimed, was not foreign to the origins and essence of Turks. A side effect of this was a mixed approach toward the West. As the inspiration of modernization, the West was to be adored. Nevertheless, at the same time, it was to be feared, for modernizing inappropriately could result in losing one's essential identity, exactly the Ottoman mistake of cosmopolitanism. The easiest and most effective way to resolve the paradox was to make modernity invariably native, to prove the existence of racial ties between Turks and Europeans. Turkish identity, thus conceived, would sever its ties with the perceived Ottoman backwardness while reining in the intrusions of Western modernity by keeping Turkishness at its core. So basically, what he's trying to say is like, from my understanding, he's saying here, like, the Turks in the Republican era sought to create a new identity because they needed a new culture to rally around, and modernity was against many of the things of the Ottoman times that are associated with like strict Islamic culture, like men having multiple wives, having very large families, stuff like that, men having to work the most, and et cetera, right? So they created the other because that's what you have to do in a modern society, in a modern Western society. You need an other to create the self. So that's what they did. Yeah, continuing here. An even better strategy was to an even better strategy was to present Turkey as the ancient essence of Western civilization. If that civilization was originally a Turkish creation, there would be no danger in adopting it. Once again, my wife tells me this all the time. Turkish saying time, guys. My Turkish wife tells me this all the time. She says, "Your geography is your destiny." And because the Turks are so close to Greece, and hell, they even owned Greece for one time, they are hell bent, or they were hell bent, at least so far in this book as it seems. They were hell bent on claiming Greek identity as their destiny. It's so crazy. You know, the easiest way to piss off a Turkish person is just tell them that kebab is really a gyro. A doner is really, some Greek dish. We just ate dinner not that long ago, and she just fed me something that came from Greece, like a Greek cucumber dish. And she says, "I feel like such a traitor. Shh, don't tell nobody." And I said, "Girl, I won't tell nobody if you tell them I don't eat fried chicken no more," etc. You get what I'm saying? So, yeah, it's the point I'm trying to make here is that how can Turks, seriously, how could these guys even seriously claim that they own Western civilization, or that they were a part of the creation of Western civilization, if Greece was not, if they were not even around Anatolia at that time? Like any reputable historian will tell you, Greece and Anatolia were owned by Greek people, then various Greek people of different city states and stuff like that. Then the Persians came. But at that time, when all of that was happening, the Turks were like way off in Central Asia, like riding on horseback. Like, once again, it doesn't make any sense. But yeah, sorry I went on that rant. I just had to get that off my chest. So, uh, if that civilization was originally a Turkish creation, there would be no danger in adopting it. The attempts to build an independent racial basis for Turkishness around purity, whiteness, and Europeanness were intended to affiliate Turkish modernity more strongly and securely with the West. In other words, putting modernity into Turkishness required, at the same time, putting Turkishness into modernity. Being truly modern could be possible only by being truly, i.e., racially, Western. On one hand, Western modernity could be construed as an attack on Turkish identity. On the other hand, building an autonomous modernity in Turkey required recognition from the West. Race operated in the interstices of this dialectic of autonomy versus recognition. It is not surprising then to see the influence of the West on the development of Turkish modernity as the result of both admiration for and aversion to it. The racial mobilization in the 1930s thus helped create an atmosphere where Turkish modernization was seen as reclaiming what was originally Turkish, rather than imitating something foreign. Racial vocabularies helped make the connections, thus presenting modernization as uniquely Turkish and Western. It was useful to establish the whiteness and Europeanness of the Turks, racially, linguistically, and historically, in order to have the category of Turkishness firmly and concretely based in the West, while keeping its unique identity. Modernization meant producing a coherent and original identity, an identity that was strongly based on the racial qualities embedded in Turkishness. This is how whiteness was associated with modernity. Whiteness ended up being a dominant yet silent social category that defined Turkishness and linked Turkey to modernity. All right, jumping into the comments here. Sasha Khan, my guy Sasha Khan. Many Greeks also do that, though. Greek coffee. I've never heard Greek coffee. That sounds hilarious. Bro, Greek coffee sounds crazy. Greek coffee sounds crazy. That sounds like there's like feta cheese floating in the grounds. Like, that's crazy. Like, in the grounds of the coffee, you'll just end up finding a slice of a cucumber. Greek coffee, guy? My guy, I've never heard Greek coffee. That is hilarious. Anyway, Acti says, I think also Turkish people claiming the European culture can be because once they were the empire that everyone looked up to and was scared of. So they are trying to say, actually, Europe copied the Ottomans. Yeah, that's essentially what Murat is trying to say in this text as well. Basically, the Turkish Republican elites, put together this idea that Western modernity is actually just our civilization repackaged, but it's a part of us that we lost, and they picked up the mantle and ran with it, and now they're more developed. So let's just take back what was originally ours. Yeah, that's essentially what they're trying to say here. But it still did not leave out whiteness. That's the thing. That's the thing. They were still trying to incorporate whiteness acti into the creation of the modern Turkish identity. Yeah, continuing here, Sasha Khan, the Ottomans were indeed the main European power in the 16th century. Yeah, I'm not debating that. I'm talking about the parts where if the Turks then were trying to say, we were the founding members of Western civilization. Remember in ancient Greece when, Plato was running around and Socrates was debating people? Like, yeah, the Turks were there too. No, y'all weren't. No, y'all weren't. Like, that's historically not true. That's historically like not true. So that's what I'm wondering by it. But if they were claiming Western civilization starting from the year, like, I don't know, 1100, 1100, 1400, whatever, right? Then maybe. Continuing here. The Ghost of the Past, Ottoman Modernization and Encounters with the West. The Ghost of the Past with which Republican modernizers had to contend had their origins in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. These were the centuries in which the idea of social change began to occupy an unprecedented place in Ottoman minds. During this period, the energies of the state and of large sectors of society were focused on the issue of transforming the empire or of resisting transformation. Not that the empire had never changed before, but conscious efforts to make, direct, or halt change became the major public agenda throughout this period. A fascination with the idea of change, of engineering change for various reasons, and of realizing the undeniable link between change, modernization, and identity, what it means to be Ottoman, were quite new to Ottoman society in this period. If we ignore the discourse of modernization and concentrate instead on acts pursuing resemblance to the West, Ottoman modernization can be traced as far back as the first half of the 18th century. Although a distinct entity called the West was relatively well shaped in the Ottoman eyes at this time, the fact that the West itself was in the process of westernization prevented it from emerging as an uncontested and clear model for social transformation. Eventually, the declaration of the Nobel Edict of the Rose Chamber, Hat i Sheref i Gulhan, in 1839, which also marked the beginning of the period of Tanzimat, reorganization, marks a turning point. Prior to that time, however, efforts to modernize the Ottoman Empire were limited to specific areas of social organization, notably the military, and encountered stiff resistance from larger segments of society. Go into the comments here. My guy Sasha Khan is chatting it up. Greek coffee is Turkish coffee when Greeks drink it. That's still hilarious, still funny. True, in Greco-Roman era, Turkey didn't exist. Absolutely. All right, continuing here. The Tulip period, Lal Devri, was among the early efforts to westernize the Ottoman Empire. The Tulip period, which lasted from 1718 to 1730, which corresponded to the reign of Ahmed III, who lived and died, no, who reigned. I don't know if that's a reign. Yeah, 1703 to 1730, witnessed the introduction of Western styles of clothing and pleasures of court life. 200 years later, early Republican historiography invariably interpreted the expensive and profligate lifestyle in the Ottoman court during this period as treachery against the Turkish people. But even before discarding the anachronistic use of the terms like Turkish and people in this formulation, we should reconsider from the perspective of the Ottoman elite the enjoyment and display of lavish pleasures as a type of modernization, although much different from the modernization pursued in ensuing periods. In an age when the grandeur of the palace was identical with the grandeur of the state, resemblance to European opulence understandably appeared as an effective tool of competition with the West. Growing tulips became a favorite pastime because the plants represented everything that was worthy of taking from Paris, although tulips were originally imported to Europe from the Ottomans in the 16th century. The level of exchange between Europe and Ottomans is a testimony to the fact that the Ottoman Empire has always been part of the European political system. It would be hasty to conclude that the Ottomans simply missed what really made the Europeans superior. A more accurate assessment would take into account the different sources and methods of obtaining knowledge in Ottoman epistemology. What appears as a superficial analogy today between tulips and Paris seemed infallible knowledge in that period. As Michel Foucault reports, 16th century Western sciences suggested using walnuts to treat head ailments because the fruit resembles the human brain in appearance. The The Ottomans employed a similar type of reasoning by formal resemblance when they thought bringing here what was there in the form of tulips, garden parties, or clothing would also bring the secrets of Western progress. Bitter struggles over seemingly insignificant symbols such as headgear or tulips were not anomalies, since they worked as the means to interact with the West in the absence of a coded discourse of modernization. The dominant view of transformation as it started in the Tulip period was to take a part of this distinct entity, the West, transplant it in a protected area, and let it live in a separate domain within the Ottoman terrain. The tulip as a symbol thus serves well to understand this idea of confined existence. The West stood as a unified entity, and resembling the West to the extent that it was possible in this period involved planting Western tulips in a separate corner in your garden, thus to restore a sense of the golden age in which the Ottomans were one of the dominant powers in European diplomacy. The Ottomans sought to improve their military by establishing a new corps instead of changing the structure of already existing military corps. To establish new army corps with the help of invited Western military experts while leaving the old corps intact also helped to strengthen perceptions as to the rigidity of borders between what was seen as the East and West. It was an easy answer to the problem of utilizing Western expertise without ceasing to be Ottomans in essence, quote unquote. The Tulip period ended with a popular uprising, however. It is unlikely that this revolt had an organized agenda against the idea of modernization. A typical Ottoman popular revolt was like a flash in the pan caused by accumulated grievances and aimed at obtaining concessions. Far from being a clash between various social groups with different social visions, these revolts were aiming to voice a patchwork of heterogeneous complaints rather than to instigate institutional changes. And indeed, 18th century Ottomans themselves did not consider overhauling the social system when they were engaged in modernization. They probably even did not have the conceptual tools to establish connections between their individual or collective lives and the way that society was organized in fact. Sorry, in the way that society was organized. In fact, the Ottomans did not appear to have a language for future-oriented reform. Instead, change, as in the modernization of the military, for them implied the restoration of the golden past of Ottoman dominance. The discourse of modernization, therefore, did not appear to be a central issue in this period. Even for areas of social life that required change and improvement, the source of the problem seemed to be internal, which explains the amount of contemporary self-confidence and content, despite the fact that the empire showed signs of losing its military prowess. The idea of segmented modernization, placing the parts side by side yet separate, seemed to be a perfect fit for the Ottoman system of organizing minorities into distinct ethno-religious groups, called the millet system. Within the confines of a pre-modern society, such a system of giving autonomy to ethno-religious groups worked fine for centuries. It is important to point out that the millet system never resulted in a complete isolation of different ethnic and religious communities. The actual working of the system was messier than the neat lines of the ideal system. Although centuries later, many journalistic and academic attempts to define and understand Turkey still use a model of a dual society, one Western and the other Eastern. The same messy permeability is true with regard to the supposedly unbreakable barriers between the two. Although the idea of modernization during the 18th century emphasized segmented adoptions, Europeans and Ottomans never stayed entirely detached from each other. What is important, however, is that there was, as of yet, no theory of cultural and social exchange that could lead the Ottomans to perceive modernization as future oriented social transformation. Modernization entailed addition without subtraction. A discourse of total modernization as a complex mix of us and them would not occur for another century. So basically, I'm assuming what he's saying here is that the Ottomans, they didn't want to modernize fully. They did not commit fully to modernization. They basically just tried tried to copy what the Europeans were doing, even if what they were doing had no cultural basis to themselves. For example, in Turkey, they grow tulips. Tulips grow like weeds out there, and the Europeans were going crazy for them. Like tulips almost crashed the Dutch economy, like the tulip mania or something like that that happened around this time in this century, right? And the Ottomans were like planting their own tulips in the garden too, trying to copy the Europeans back there, right? Continuing, uh, Sultan Selimán III, who continued the trend of modernization along the same lines as before, reforming the military with the help of European officers and creating a separate sphere for the newly created Army Corps. Selim III established a small force called Nizam-i-Jadid, the New Order, that existed side by side with the old army. The new corps was trained by European military experts and was even financed by an independent treasury. Irad-i-Jedi, in addition, specialized factories and schools opened for the only purpose of providing ammunition and officers for this army. The tendency of segmented modernization continued well into the 19th century. European style schools, army corps, and courts existed side by side with their Ottoman counterparts. Up to this point, the discourse of modernization did not involve explicitly racial categories. Fundamental changes were taking place at the same time, however. Toward the middle of the 19th century, modernization efforts acquired a different form in two major ways. Most importantly, the Ottoman elite started to believe that there was something wrong with the empire, although the nature of that something was in contention. And this sense that the empire might be in decline led to a sharp diversion from the segmented modernization of the past, because this time what was imported from the West was supposed to be used to create something Ottoman, not merely placed alongside what already existed. The majority of the religious elite, ulama, was especially instrumental in justifying military reforms not only by confirming the religiously acceptable nature of reforms, but also by arguing that imitating Western military technology would not mean a loss of Ottoman identity, because the ulama reasoned this: learning from the infidels should not give rise to any feelings of inferiority among the Muslims. They should keep in mind that the progress of Christian Europe in military science was but the reaction of the frightened West to the superiority of Ottoman arms and Muslim heroism over many centuries. Also, Western economic principles which the Ottomans should adopt were ideas which the Europeans had taken from our Islamic religious laws. The Muslims only take back what originally had been borrowed from them. Interesting. And that was said by that was quoted from another writer in 2004. Okay, continuing here. The trope of reappropriation, whereby what is imported from without is said to have had its origins within, thus had a long history. Integrating parts of Western knowledge into Ottoman society, the ulama argued, would in fact recover the essence of Ottoman civilization. It is not clear how much the idea of modernization as a tool to stop social decline and to save the state was prevalent among the general population. Most likely, the notion of decline was mainly entertained by the elites who had closer contacts with Europeans. They got this too, as well as military reforms from the West. European publics shared an expectation that the Ottoman decline was imminent. The, this idea of imminent decline produced a yearning for an exotic golden age in the East among some Western writers. In a scholarly article published in 1915, surveying Anatolian lands and peoples, for example, its American author longs for a lost authenticity in connecting Ottoman decline to the Western rise to prominence. The peoples and ideas emanating from within the realm, which still bears the name of Turkey, have left an indelible mark on the rest of the world. Its heritage of memories and the prestige of a happier and grander past are undisturbed by torches of sad decline. The foundations of our progressive spirit were laid in that eastern region. It is the seat of our civilization and the cradle of our religion. This was written by Dominion, 1915. Interesting. The Western concerns with saving the Ottoman Empire is especially visible in positive accounts. Regardless of whether positive or negative, however, these Western accounts of the Ottomans were instrumental in the incorporation of the idea of decline into the Ottoman discourse of modernization. The image of the Orient was already racialized, that the Ottomans as a people were essentially different from and generally inferior to Europeans was widespread in Europe, and it was only a step further for the elites to build comparisons between East and West using terms already well established in Europe: manners and lifestyle, technological and scientific advances, the treatment of women, and private property, and to connect these differences to essential racial characteristics. At the same time, the only way for those who were outside the elite circles to engage with the discourse of decline and belated modernization was through the experience of military defeats. However, it was realized and however it was defined, the actual weakening of the Ottoman Empire was relevant to the development of a discourse of decline and the commitment needed for modernization and the concomitant need for modernization. Okay, meaning the simultaneous desire or need for modernization. Okay, I get it. All right. Although decline and its perception did not necessarily occur simultaneously, many developments at the turn of the 19th century indicated that the power of the Ottoman state was being challenged in many ways. The control of North African and Middle Eastern territories seemed to be minimal. Nationalist uprisings in the Balkan territories presented new challenges to the maintenance of state authority. Even in Anatolia, only a few provinces were strictly under control of the central government. Wars, especially with Russia, were sapping the resources of the empire. The occupation of Egypt by France in 1798 lasted only briefly, but had important psychological effects. As a result of the French expedition, the Ottomans started to seek cooperation with other Western states in order to curb French influence. In the meantime, the Sultan's authority was not as uncontested as before, because a group of local notables, Ayan, had begun to establish their own authority in the peripheral provinces. The confrontations between the old and the new were especially severe in the Ottoman military. The Janissaries had influenced the rise and fall of the sultans since the 17th century, and all the attempts to eliminate the Janissary power before Mahmud II had proven unsuccessful. The Janissary army represented the old order within an army trained in Western techniques. This was possible in the framework of segmented modernization. For people that don't know, Janissaries were basically like Christian kids kidnapped from the Balkans who were converted to Islam and trained to be like the highest level of soldiers in the Ottoman Empire, right? Anyway, the Janissary army represented the old order within an army trained in Western techniques. This was possible in the framework of segmented modernization, as the idea of interaction and contradiction between the old and the new slowly started to set in. The conflict between imported novelties and already established practices grew, and the concept of modernization became more politically charged. It is true that Sultan Mahmud II tried to downplay this conflict by calling his new Western-style army Asakir-i Manshuri-i Muhammadiyya, or the soldiers of the Prophet Muhammad. But the massacre of hundreds of Janissaries on June 15th, 1826, and the subsequent abolition of the Janissary Corps were events that were more than merely ways of dealing with a force that continuously had been challenging the sultanic authority. This was rather a large-scale attempt to deal with the confrontation of the East and the West in the Ottoman Empire in a way that rejected segmented coexistence and intervened in favor of one, the Western, while demolishing the other, the Eastern. Issues of the compatibility or incompatibility of the East and the West occupied a central place within the discussions of modernization in the late Ottoman and the early Republican eras. Are they really incompatible? Is there a find? Is there a find a way to is there a way to find typos in this book? Is there a way to find to combine the two in a coherent way? Is there a way to find is there a find a way to combine the two in a coherent identity? I've never heard that phrase before. Is there a find a way? Is there a way to combine the two in a coherent identity? I don't know why the word find is there. Typos in this book. I'm finding them all the time. The termination of the old army was completed with the abolition of fiefdoms, Timar, the Ottoman land system, in which the Sultan granted land to individuals in return for military units, especially the cavalry. Sipahi, as in early attempts at military modernization, Western experts were invited to restructure the Ottoman armed forces in the post Janissary and post Timur era. Prussian and French officers took over the modernization of the Ottoman army, while British naval experts embarked on the renovation of the Ottoman navy. In 1827, a medical school for army personnel was established. A school of military sciences followed it in 1834. During the reign of Mahmud II, the Ottoman government sent a number of students to European countries to study sciences seen as relevant to the training of military officers. Education, bureaucracy, and taxation benefited from military reforms in indirect ways, and the entire episode of modernizing the Ottoman army revealed the fact that containing the reforms in a single domain of life was becoming increasingly difficult. Although the military was certainly at the epicenter of the earthquake of modernization, shockwaves were slowly hitting other institutions, most notably education. Some attempts to reorganize the bureaucracy took place as well, particularly to collect taxes more efficiently and to pay for military modernization. Mahmud II's reforms abolished several old offices and created new ones that were organized along the lines of European bureaucracies. The establishment of European-style ministries also took place in this period. Who's writing this? Who's checking this? I am so mad this editor allowed this to slip through. Uh, Sasha Khan said, "Is it translated from English to Turkish?" I don't know. I don't know if this was translated from English to Turkish. But either way, even if there were translations, these sorts of mistakes are very, very problematic. Very problematic. Anyway, Mahmud II's reforms abolished several old offices and created new ones that were organized along the lines of European bureaucracies. The establishment of European style ministries also took place in this period. Perhaps one of the most important was the creation of a foreign ministry in 1836, which can be seen as another sign of Ottoman intentions to deal with Europe on European terms at a more institutional level. Reforms in the bureaucracy influenced education too. Two educational institutions for the training of higher officials opened in 1838. Reform in another area, taxation, was driven to increase revenues for the military reforms. I'm just going to say this here. I'm going to just inject this right here. They're talking about how the Ottomans were trying to reform their empire by basically inviting all these smart European intellectuals to reform their military and their different parts of their government and stuff like that. Then also they were sending their sons and daughters, well, mostly their sons. They were sending their sons to like military academies in Europe to like learn the tricks of the trade, like what the white folks are doing. What does that do to the mind? Think about this. If you're a black child growing up in a public school and all you have are white teachers through your entire education, you never see a black person giving you instruction. What does that do to your mind? It makes you think that white people must be superior, that white people must be smarter, et cetera, et cetera. The Turks were no different. They're not immune to that its sort of effect. So I'm pretty sure that was having an effect too on crystallizing in their mind that modernity comes from whiteness, and whiteness and modernity are interlinked, right? All right, continuing here. From the early 19th century on, the centralization of state power emerged as a major factor in Ottoman modernization. A modern state increasingly began to be equated with the central government's and bureaucracy's authority, especially during the reign of Mahmud II. A powerful military was also considered an indispensable tool to increase the control of the central government over that of local notables in the Balkans, Egypt, and the Arab lands. The use of military modernization to consolidate the authority of the central government started with Selim III's Nizam-i-Chedi. The reformed army and bureaucracy became crucial tools of centralization in the hands of the Sultan. The traditional Ottoman system of minimal government, where local groups managed their internal affairs, was replaced by complex bureaucratic machinery and strict controls over actual and potential rivals to the Sultan's authority. For the 19th century modernization, centralization ended up being a crucial Centralization ended up being such a crucial component that the idea of saving the state increasingly began to mean crushing anything that could be an obstacle to the authority of the central government. Whether that was the provincial notables, the religious elites, guilds, or the Janissary Corps, Mahmud II had to undermine the influence of the religious elites, ulama, and popular religious groups without engaging in an ideological war with them, especially considering the fact that a large part of the religious elite had given ideological support to the reform efforts in the military. Therefore, he attacked the financial foundation of the religious elite by setting up a new directorate of charitable endowments, Avkaf, uh, whose revenues were previously outside government controls. The Ottoman Empire at the end of the reign of Mahmud II may have seemed weak against Western powers, but as in the increasingly centralized states in Europe, the power of the central government had climbed to an unprecedented level in Ottoman history. In the early 19th century modernization, clothing became an important symbol of the newly emerging perception of East and West. A turning point along these lines was the introduction of military uniforms to distinguish the new corps from the Janissaries. Bureaucrats, too, were expected to follow certain sartorial codes. An 1829 law specified the appropriate clothing and headgear to be worn by government officials. Frock coats and fezzes were to create a sense of uniformity among government officials. The law also removed sartorial marks of identity between different groups, including religious communities. Fezzes placed the state at the center of Ottoman life as the sole remaining arbiter of identity. In a single symbolic yet crucial act, Mahmud II thus radically challenged the traditional millet system, which was based on the separation of religious groups, and signaled the construction of a secular Ottoman identity, which later was formalized in the Tanzimat era. The visibility of uniforms and other types of clothing associated with the West also marked an era when cultural objects and practices increasingly started to symbolize larger cultural debates on the nature of modernity and westernization. Just as French uniforms symbolized the post Janissary army, so the replacement of the turban and the robe by the fez and the frock coat among the bureaucracy represented Mahmud II's efforts to force Europeanization on the civilian branches of the government. Moreover, the introduction of standardized clothing codes for both Muslim and non Muslim citizens of the empire paved the way for the discourse of citizenship or of the people that became prominent in the following years. Something I just want to say, you know, imagine a world where the president of the United States had to wear a keffiyeh and a thobe and dress like the rulers of Saudi Arabia to show that he was professional. Like Donald Trump and Biden would have to get on stage and dress like Ottoman rulers, or they would have to dress like African kings, like Nigerian Yoruba princes or something, to have their debate. That's how wild it is to imagine, like, people all over the world dress like Italian dandies from the 18th century when they wear suits and ties. Right? We consider this now the way of dressing that is sophisticated, the standard for all men around the world, but it is based on a culture that was imposed upon the world and also adopted by people who wanted to attach themselves to whiteness and modernity and that sort of thing. Continuing here. Continuing here, as these particular changes accumulated by the second half of the 19th century, the idea of change itself had acquired a new meaning. The rhetoric of reverting back to the golden Ottoman past was slowly being rivaled by the idea of future-oriented change. Modernization and westernization were developing literal and figurative affinities. Westernization as a tool to ameliorate certain, especially military, weaknesses gave way to perceptions of westernization as an end in itself. Being modern began to imply a project of almost total societal transformation with direct individual consequences. In the 100 years between 1760 and 1860, the changes which had been imposed from above were increasingly understood and accepted, leading to a new self awareness and linked to it a new and more active interest in the political process, a new concern to take part in the movement of change and determine its direction. modernization. Three caveats are in order with regard to this embrace of modernization and westernization toward the end of the Ottoman era. First, the change in the perception of westernization during the Tanzimat does not mean that contracts between the Ottomans and Western societies started only then. What was different is that earlier context did not translate into a desire to westernize society, radically because the Ottomans still perceived themselves as superior to the West, despite occasional military mishaps. Second, it is imperative to focus more on the reception and renegotiation of Western influence instead of merely paying attention to contact with the West per se. What we observe in the 19th century is not a passive reception of Western influences, but an active process of reinterpretation and conflict. Therefore, changes in the Ottoman perception of social change need to be considered along with the content of change. And third, the end of segmented modernization, the rise of the view of change as a societal project, and the erosion of feelings of superiority during and after the Tanzimat period should be seen as only the beginning of an uncertain process. Modernization is certainly a conflict-ridden process. Even among the Ottoman elites, there were great schisms with regard to the nature of modernization. To witness the relative dominance of modernization as a comprehensive societal project, we will need to wait until the Republican period. Continuing here. The Tanzimat consists of a number of reforms during the reigns of Abdul Mejid and Abdul Aziz. These reforms are characterized by two imperial edicts: the Noble Edict of the Rose Chamber and of November 3rd, 1839, already mentioned, and the Imperial Edict of February 18th, 1856. The Noble Edict's introduction of the principles of individual liberty, freedom from oppression, and equality before the law was revolutionary. For the first time, the notion of limiting sultanic authority was being enunciated in a formal document. The Imperial Edict addressed the issue of Christian citizens of the Ottoman Empire and continued the same concern about equality that emerged with the Noble Edict. This was another substantial blow to the traditional Ottoman system of millets, which depended on the relative autonomy of religious groups from the central government, not only because it marked the rise of a discourse of equality, but also because it laid the groundwork for justifying extensive government control to limit the autonomy of distinct groups. The edicts came at a time when the Ottoman government was under intense pressure from the European countries regarding its Christian citizens. Western publics tended to perceive the reforms as gestures that paid lip service to legal equality merely to secure concessions from the European powers. However, some scholars emphasize the fact that the reforms came as a result of the internal dynamics of the empire, especially as a result of the need to consolidate the power of the central state. The Noble Edict's promise of security for life and property was actually directed to the masses in order to rally them behind the thrones and the bureaucracy in their struggle with the ayans, the provincial notables. However, the changes went beyond the intended results. Even the relatively novel necessity of rallying the masses behind the throne and the bureaucracy through ideological mobilization indicated the unprecedented changes were taking place in Ottoman society. Military renovation continued through the Tanzimat with the introduction of conscription into the Ottoman Empire. Changes in the bureaucratic structure continued too. Reforms in legal and educational domains, however, no longer simply looked like the side effects of military reform. For example, a civil service school that was established in 1859 led to the emergence of a new group of administrative elites distant from the old. The school morphed into the political science department at the University of Ankara in the Republican period and served as a major center for the recruitment of elite administrators. Educational reform in 1846 and a more comprehensive reform in 1869 attempted to build a standard network of elementary and secondary schools throughout the Ottoman lands. Although extremely difficult to implement, the emphasis on educational mobilization at the elementary and secondary levels was a radical effort to consolidate the power of the central government in domains that formerly belonged to autonomous religious groups. Reforms in law invaded another domain of life traditionally characterized by the control and administration of religious communities. Reforms of commercial and penal codes were followed by the reform of the Civil Code in 1870 through 1876. But the newly established state courts still had to exist separately outside the jurisdiction of religious courts. Capitulations, legal exemptions granted to foreigners and non-Muslim Ottoman citizens who were under the protection of Western powers added to the sense of the lack of a central legal framework within the empire, because those individuals enjoying the privileges provided by capitulations would not even be subject to the Ottoman criminal law. In a way, it is possible to understand the legal reforms during the Tanzimat as attempts to show the West the egalitarian nature of the Ottoman law and to establish the conditions for the eradication of capitulations. It is not surprising that in the post-Tanzimat era, organized opposition to sultanic power surfaced among the intellectuals and bureaucrats. The group identified as the Young Ottomans was one of the first in the sense, although they did not have a unified ideological agenda. Although Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed by a more traditional form of popular uprising organized by theological students in Istanbul. I like the way he framed that. A more traditional form of popular uprising. Jihadis. That's funny. Um, the friction between the Sultan and bureaucracy reached its peak following the Sultan's deposition, when a group of higher bureaucrats gained control and formed a new cabinet, convinced that the Sultan's authority should be curbed institutionally and that higher bureaucrats should have a power base independent of the Sultan. They persuaded the new Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, to agree to a constitution. The first constitution of the Ottoman Empire was passed on December 23rd, 1876. Although the Sultan continued to hold complete executive power, the constitution devised a bicameral parliamentary system that was intended to assist the Sultan. The lower house would consist of deputies elected by indirect popular vote. In less than a year, Abdul Hamid II indefinitely dissolved the parliament using the constitutional power. The Ottoman parliament would not reconvene again until 1908. One of Tanzimat's legacies was to catapult the discourse of modernization into the public arena. Even if modernization was essentially an elite-driven process, the need for popular support behind modernization complemented the emergence of quote-unquote the people as a political category. Similarly, the rhetorical power of the specter of decline for the proponents of saving the state helped connect modernization with the Ottoman state's project of survival. While modernity rhetorically established itself as a central value, its content as a program was unclear. In fact, it is difficult to draw neat battle lines of pre-modernization and anti-modernization groups and individuals, because while groups heavily invested in anti-modernization rhetoric were incorporating Western-inspired practices at an increasing pace, those who seemed to favor modernization would not hesitate to engage in a harsh critique of what they considered the excesses of modernity. For example, according to a study of Turkish novel, well, that doesn't make sense. Typos. It was the Tanzimat novelist who on the one hand imported the novel as a modern form, but on the other were involved in relentless critique of character type, the extremely westernized dandy Alafrunga Zupe in their novels. Turkish is hilarious. This type later would be reproduced as the westernized traitor Alfranga Hain during the War of Turkish Independence in the hands of the Republican elite. Even members of the ruling elite who initiated the Tanzimat reforms liberally criticized the intrusions of modernity. Later, the young Ottomans criticized the modernizing reforms for being too cosmopolitan and rootless, a critique that decades later would be incorporated into the Republican narrative of conversion. It is important to note that the critique of what was considered superficial and rootless Westernization did not lead to a rejection of Westernization as an ideal. Instead, it was this critique that unleashed the question of identity and the search for an authentic modernity. In the popular image in European countries, Abdul Hamid II, the Sultan who abolished the first constitution, figures as the epitome of an Oriental despot. According to an early 20th century British biographer of Abdul Hamid II, it would be pleasant, but is difficult to find anything in favor of Abdul Hamid. Even the pleasantness stories told of him usually speak of his vanity. Jumping into the comments here, Acti says, we also have Ala Franga toilet, which is the modern toilet that we use today, and Ala Turca toilet, which is the one where you squat. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. So I guess the Ala Franga toilet is the one. Would an Ala Franga toilet also be the one that has the little, bidet in it? Because in Turkey, every toilet has the bidet that shoots in your butt, which you will not find in America, unfortunately, right? So is the Ala Franga toilet actually also the bidet toilet? Let us know. Anyway, continuing here. So Western publics labeled him, Abdul Hamid II, as the Red Sultan for his repression of Armenians between 1894 and 1896. Similarly, both the Ottoman and the Republican elites saw the person of Abdul Hamid II not only an autocrat, but also a religious fanatic because of his continuous references to pan-Islamism as a glue to keep the empire together. Recent research reveals that it is more appropriate to interpret Abdul Hamid II's reign as a logical continuation of the Tanzimat reforms. His reign was not a negation of modernization. On the contrary, it was the epitome of Tanzimat modernization, with its emphasis on consolidating state power vis-a-vis all others that might ask for a share of political power. Acti says in the comments right here, bidet was our own magical touch. Okay, so we have the Alafranga, Turca, bidet. Alafranga, Turca, bidet. There we go. Anyway, continuing here, especially in terms of the transfer of technology, Abdul Hamid II was not hesitant to import from Europe. However, with the idea of modernization coming more and more to the foreground, a chronic sense of uneasiness was emerging. The end of segmented modernization created the difficult problem of combining the Ottoman and Western. Defining the nature of what was essentially Ottoman, in turn, proved to be more difficult than ever at a time when the empire was undergoing rapid transformation with constant territorial losses, ethnic secessions, and the encroachment of a capitalist world economy. Abdul Hamid II was also modern in the sense that while the real power the empire seemed to be declining, he increasingly employed Western-style symbolism and rituals to legitimize state authority and to mobilize formerly passive groups in society as citizens. During the reign of Abdul Hamid II, although territorial losses almost completely halted, the search for the Ottoman identity and modernity and the post-Tanzimat gap between elites and other segments of society kept society simmering. Political distinctions spilled over into the cultural form of modernity, and cultural boundaries were drawn ever more acutely. Continuing here. Let's see if I can finish up this chapter. So going back, we're on page 65. I wonder if I can get through all of this today, because I think I'm only going to be on live maybe like 30 more minutes. All right, I'm on page 65. Yeah, chapter 3 once again is hella long. Very long. Chapter 3 is the longest chapter here. Once again, and this guy is very, very long-winded. I feel like I'm getting a history on Tanzimat. We just want to know if Turkish people are white. Come on now. Chapter 3 is incredibly long. Chapter 3 is like a very long live stream. Yeah, I don't think I can get through it. I think it goes, yep. Yeah, so chapter 4 is on page 99. So yeah, can't get through it. That's like 40 more pages. That's probably going to be tomorrow's live stream, like finishing chapter 3, right? But we're going to try to get through as much of this as we can. We were on page 65, if I remember. 62. Let me jump ahead. 64. All right. Water break. All right, jumping into the comments right here. My beautiful wife says, the way you imitate Turkish words is so hot and silly. Y'all are hilarious. Y'all are funny. I'm trying here. I'm trying to read. Anyway, On the one hand were the smooth, Paris-oriented statesmen. On the other, country bumpkins. The difference was the difference between French culture and Islamic culture. The new elite was quick to organize against the regime, beginning in the 1880s, founding the political organization known as Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, which would rule the empire between 1908 and 1918. The background of this group of intellectuals and military officers, popularly known as the Young Turks, was mainly the military medical college and other modern educational institutions that Abdul Hamid II himself had supported. When their conspiracies against sultanic authority were discovered, the CUP members, who operated as a secret organization until they took over power, had to continue their critique in exile in European countries. Compare with the young Ottomans before them, who were critical of the extreme modernization of the Tanzimat and the resulting cultural gap between the elite and the people. The Young Turks singled out positivism and later a solidarism inspired by it as their favorite ideology. Educated in state schools established to modernize bureaucracy, but brought up with the ideal of preserving the state. These young men found in the social engineering aspects of Comte the legitimization the legitimation of the elitist outlook. Science was the rock on which they leaned. Although they opposed the authority of the Sultan, the Young Turks were not liberals at heart. The Young Turk positivism, in fact, supported a virulent form of political and cultural elitism. The palpable autocratic tendencies of the Republican regime can directly be traced back to Young Turk positivism, and solidarism. The former resulted in an image of social change in the framework of social engineering, while the latter promoted a sense of homogeneous society that discouraged dissent. Such was the ideology that came to power in 1908. In this revolutionary period, the Sultan came under pressure from various groups, but the most decisive of all was the involvement of the army. When Abdul Hamid II was unable to suppress an uprising and could no longer rely on the support of his army, he had no choice but to restore the constitution, which he did on July 24th, 1908. A rebellion among the low ranked soldiers in the army in 1909, which was mainly against higher rank officers and the introduction of Western methods into the armed forces, led to the Abdul Hamid II being deposed on April 24th, 1909. He was replaced by Mehmed V. Constitutional amendments were introduced to solidify the power of the parliament against the Sultan, but the real power of governing now belonged to the CUP and the army officers. The CUP consolidated its power in 1913 after staging a coup and establishing a new cabinet. The Young Turk era was characterized by intense and widespread debates about the nature of modernization. The rise of modern journalism provided one of the main forms of discussion among the intellectuals. Disastrous policies followed by the CUP in international relations, especially successive wars with consequent territorial losses in the Balkans, and continuing national uprisings among the Christian minorities of the empire, revealed the sense of existential crisis and its attendant discourse of saving the state. Among intellectuals, Young Turk rule intensified the centralization of state power by introducing further administrative reforms. Yet this power, although condensed in the center, was not extensive. The Ottoman state had difficulty collecting taxes to finance the wars fought in the Balkans. In this context, reforms to improve elementary education and to develop industrialization were bound to give only limited results. Okay, so that was quite a lot that we're reading right here, and man, I really wanted to get through chapter 3, but I really just don't feel like I got the time. I really feel like I don't got the time or the energy to get all the way through chapter 3. So I feel like here is a good cutoff point to finish up this live stream. And I hope everybody enjoyed it. If y'all have any questions, put them in the chat right now. If you have any reactions to this text yourself, put them in the chat right now. If you just like what I do, just give me a thumbs up. That would be really great. I'll be back tomorrow for part 3 of this book. Once again, I think the major problem with this book is the Turk, a white man, is that he's very careful to do it on with kid gloves, if you know what I mean. You know what I mean? Like he doesn't want to just go out with it and critique the society and then give the history later, or report what the history is like, or report what the story is like in Turkey now. He'd much rather build up every single point with the mountains and data and a ton of facts, which makes this book, a bit harder to read than others. But once again, guys, if you have a book that you want me to react to, put it in the chat, send it my way. I'd be very interested in reading it. I got the free hookup on books for anybody who wants any. And I'm going to wrap this up here. But shout out to everybody who came in. Shout out to Acti. Shout out to Sasha Khan. Shout out to Andre Beja. Shout out to Avery Adams. Shout out to everybody who's been rocking with me. Y'all be easy out there, and peace.